Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Work Expert Insights into Workplace and Market Trends panel event, the kickoff event for our inaugural Berkeley Global Career Week. My name is Randeep Kular, and I am the Career Services Manager here at UC Berkeley Extension, and will be moderating today's event. With that, let's get started by introducing Frederick Verle, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs here at UC Berkeley Extension, who will be kicking us off.
Thank you so much, Randeep, and welcome to everybody. It's such a great pleasure to see so many people come together to participate in this fascinating event about the trends that are going to shape our post-pandemic workplace and markets. At this point, I would like to take a quick moment, actually, as part of this introduction, to acknowledge this unprecedented change we are witnessing today across the globe. I think never before has the world seen such drastic change in the workplace and in the workflow force in one single year. Take Salesforce, for example, something that we are very close to just because Salesforce occupies the San Francisco landmark Salesforce Tower. And this company, this emblematic company, just announced a few weeks ago that staff would not have to come back to the office. At the same time, I believe never before has the world really risen to this type of challenge of an economic and health crisis so well, effectively coming out of it stronger than before in many industries. However, these successes that we celebrate on the one side are already casting a pretty rapidly growing shadow on literally millions of jobs that are being transformed or eliminated. And I think never before have we felt, at least in our generation, how much the world will not go back to the way it was before, especially in the professional realm. So leading the academic innovation and design here at Berkeley's Continuing Education Department, I can tell you we are working tirelessly to figure out with our colleagues in academia and in industry how we can design programs and find solutions for everyone who needs to reskill and upskill in order to advance their careers, stay current, and support their families and communities. And therefore, I'm really deeply thankful to our career services team and all the support staff who have organized this amazing event, which is followed by an entire career week dedicated to empowering everyone, professionals, lifelong learners, students, to figure out how we can take the next steps in our careers. And I'm extremely thankful to this incredible panel that we have here today for taking the time to share your insights that will help us all better understand what the future of work really holds for all of us. Thank you all so much. I can't wait to get this going. And please take it away, Randeep.
Thank you, Frederick, for that welcome. Now, I'm very excited to say that we have a great group of panelists here today to speak to us about what the future of work is from their varying backgrounds and perspectives. So let's dive right in by having our panelists introduce themselves and tell us a bit about their professional backgrounds. Andrew, you want to kick us off?
Sure. So I'm Andrew Chamberlain. I'm the Chief Economist and Research Director at Glassdoor. So I'm an applied labor economist working in technology. And I run the research group at Glassdoor, which is a hiring and company review site, which many of you may have seen. My team does a lot of data science and machine learning and statistics and model prototyping. And our goal is to help companies and job seekers understand the environment in which they are operating, and help people get hired and help companies hire talent. So you can learn all about the research that we do at glassdoor.com/research.
All right, my name is Sherry Sims. I am the founder and CEO of Black Career Women's Network. We are a national organization that supports the professional development of African-American women. We provide coaching, mentoring, and workshops. And we are a national organization, so we also do conferences, which we can't do right now because of COVID. But our main goal really is to bridge the gap of support of professional development and mentor access for women of color in the workplace. I also have a background in human resources. For 20 years, worked in talent acquisition and just recently moved into the diversity and inclusion space as well. And that's really the background of what I do. You can find out more about Black Career Women's Network at bcwnetwork.com.
My name is Brian Kropp. I'm the Chief of Research for Gartner's HR practice. And we're the world's biggest research and advisory firm for HR executives. We provide research tools, services to heads of HR, heads of recruiting, heads of diversity inclusion, total rewards, and so on, to help them effectively manage their workforces in ways that drive their performance, retention, and the business outcomes that are associated with that.
Great. And my name is Elizabeth Bill. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Workplace Culture at Everfi. Everfi is an international technology company that's committed to driving deep social change through digital education. So we work with schools, we work with colleges and universities, and with corporations on critical issues like the racial wealth gap, on sustainability, diversity, equity, and inclusion, mental health, and the like. So in my role, I particularly work with our corporate partners to help them create thriving, positive workplace cultures. Before coming to Everfi a couple of years ago, I was the Chief Legal Officer and Chief Ethics Officer of the Society for Human Resource Management. I have also served as a legal and policy advisor at the EEOC, which is the federal agency that prosecutes and protects individuals against harassment and discrimination in the workplace. So I'm delighted to be with you all today.
Thank you for those great introductions. So let's dive into our questions. First up, given your very unique backgrounds and experiences, what is the first thing that comes to mind when I say the words future of work? Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, when we talk about the future of work, where a lot of people go is new technology, AI, machine learning, et cetera, replacing jobs, creating new jobs, changing how we work, and so on. And that is certainly true, but that's a very narrow part of the future of work. There's a couple of other things that I think are really important to be thinking about as we're looking at this. As Frederick was alluding to at the beginning, one of the other major components of the future of work that we've seen is that location is going to change dramatically, and we're no longer going to be constrained to a particular place to do work. But that was something that was already occurring. The pandemic just radically accelerated that. There's three other things, though, that I think are really important as we think about the future of work. The first one is not just shifting the location where people work, but shifting when people work and shifting time from that perspective. We're increasingly seeing more work starting to be done asynchronously. It used to be kind of chasing the sun across the globe from a development perspective, but now it is letting people work whenever they want to. So time is shifting dramatically. I think the second one is the rate of skill change is shifting dramatically. To give you just a little bit of analysis here, we download every job posting that's on the internet in our kind of nerdy, wonky sort of way. And one of the things that we find with that's really, really amazing is that about half of the skills that companies were looking for in their job postings just 4 or 5 years ago no longer occur on job postings today. So one way to think about there's been about a 50% turnover in the skills that companies are looking for. So just massive change from a skills perspective, and that's only going to get faster. And then the third thing that I think is really important as we think about the future of work is the nature of the relationship between employees and employers and how that is changing. It used to be the sense that I had a job and I went and worked for some company, and when the day started, I was working for them, and when the day ended, I'm not working for them anymore. But that relationship has, especially across the last year, for some employees, has shifted to be a much more humane relationship, where an employer cares a lot more about their employees from a mental health perspective, from their family perspective, from their community perspective, and so on. And now, while that's occurred for some employees, other employees and other jobs have gone in the other direction and become even much more transactional. And as we think about what a more contract-based economy looks like, we're seeing that perhaps become less humane from that perspective. So what's different now as we think about the future of work, I really think is this question of different time when people are working and the impact of time along the dimension of work, the rapid change in terms of skills and demand, and this humane or inhumane changing nature of the relationship. Those, I think, are going to be the next three defining characteristics in terms of how we think about how the future of work is going to be changing going forward.
Ryan, something you said really, all of it really resonated with me, and I couldn't agree more with what you identified. The part about humanity was something that I was thinking about as well. And when I think about the future of work, again, in addition to what you said, so the idea of how we are operating in a humane way, and vis-a-vis not only our internal communities, but the external communities in which our organizations are operating, right? So community impact is what I think is going to be a lens of focus for many workplaces and organizations going forward. So, and for us as individuals. So how do I use my role to have a positive impact on the people around me in my organization? How does my organization use the work that we do to drive change in the world? How are we serving people for good? So I think this focus on, and as you said, there's work to be done certainly across the spectrum, but how do we use work for the greater good? I think that started a bit before COVID. I think COVID has definitely deepened that focus and in the need to use corporations for good. And I think it will continue afterwards as well.
Yeah, just one quick data point on that front. We survey employees all the time. We end up collecting survey data from about 10 million people per year. And one of the things that comes through, and depending upon how you look at it, it's a little bit different, but somewhere between 75 to 90% of employees expect their employer to get actively involved in the societal debates, the cultural debates, their communities. And that is really different than 10 years ago. Today's employee, especially employees entering the workforce now, believe that their company should become actively involved in the societal, political, cultural debates of the day and be a force for good, not just a force for profit.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. Even with, some of the, some of the racial tension that was happening a lot in last year, that there were a lot of employees who were looking for their employers to make a statement or have a stance on the social climate. And they're, and as myself being in this space of D&I and working with women of color in the workplace, I was asking for feedback, what is your employer doing, or what have they said? Are they taking a stance on the social climate right now? So yeah, you're absolutely on target, Brian, when it comes to they want to see that you are not just, we're just here working, but they want to know that they're part of something bigger than just what they're contributing to your organization.
And one of the reasons, to chime in here, that I think that this has been a trend in the last 10 years of more companies being responsive to employee desires to get involved in social issues, or being more aware of like ethics and treatment of employees, is transparency, not just from online reviews and things like that that's in my world at Glassdoor, but also from social media. Like there's just less of a barrier between frontline workers and executives today, and companies can be put under pressure in a public way that just was really not the case 15 years ago.
Yeah, I agree with you, Andrew. It's almost as if social media has kind of put you in a place where you can no longer hide. You can't hide behind any of these things anymore, that you do have to take a stance now, or you'll be called out. I mean, and you have people who will do it.
And I think companies are getting a little bit more comfortable around being more transparent, instead of taking that sort of defensive, I'm not sure I want to share what we're doing or what we're saying, keeping that behind closed doors. There are a lot of efforts out there to publish the work that's being done, both in terms of initiatives that they're undertaking in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, publishing data. Andrew, I know that your organization has helped shine a light a lot on some of the data related to diversity, and getting comfortable around, being very transparent about the work that they're doing and where they're falling short as well.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things that we've seen in terms of companies becoming more transparent is something that Salesforce has done. So at Salesforce, what you're actually able to see as an employee is some of the upward reviews that other managers have gotten. So before you take a different job within Salesforce, you're actually able to read about the person that might be your manager, which just creates a completely different level of transparency from an employee's career journey perspective, but also puts a lot of pressure on that manager to make sure that they're managing their employees in a way that actually works for employees and isn't kind of the boss of yesteryear, where it's like, I'm the boss, so you do what I say, sorts of things like that. That mentality just won't work anymore going forward.
I like Salesforce approach. I like that.
Well, what's interesting about it, just real quick as well, is as some companies start to do that, it just becomes the expectation for everybody. And for on this call, there's a lot of folks that are in school, and one of the things that you can do while you're in school is you actually get all sorts of feedback about your professors before you take a class from them, right? You can see, you just get a ton of information about it, and then people are reasonably asking, it's like, well, if I can learn that much about my professor, why can't I learn that much about my boss before I take a job? And you're kind of like, that's a good question. I don't have a good answer as to say why we shouldn't do that. But that degree of transparency that's occurring everywhere is certainly moving into the workplace. And if you're going to be a manager or a leader at a company, you're really facing this question in terms of how you want to manage your workforce, which is, am I going to pretend that that information doesn't exist? Or am I going to accept that that information exists and figure out how to manage and lead in an environment where there's a lot more information, not all of which is accurate, but certainly a lot more information from that perspective?
Yeah, I think it just makes for a better collaborative team, work environment, and trust is fostered a lot more when you are transparent in that way. And I think there's nothing wrong with managers being able to share, this is the type of management style that I have, explaining that to their direct reports, so they give them an opportunity to understand how to work with them, and vice versa. And I also think that there's nothing wrong with direct reports asking the question, can you describe to me what your management style is, and asking questions to gain clarity around how to work with their manager. So I think we, again, like you said, Brian, it's no longer this dictatorship of do what I say. This is about how can we work together collaboratively, because at the end of the day, we both have the same end result, which is to get the work done, to meet the initiative. So let's look at this as two adults working together versus this parent-child dictatorship type of relationship, which is how management has been in the past.
These are all great points. Thank you so much for sharing. And it actually goes very well into our next question, which is talking specifically about the workplace. A lot of you addressed some of these points around the switch to remote work, the focus on mental health, diversity, equity, inclusion being very important in current trends, right? So what are we currently seeing in the workplace, and what do you think is here to stay? Elizabeth, you want to start us off on that conversation?
Sure, thanks so much. Well, you're right, so much has changed, and really, especially over the past year. But I think, as Frederick noted earlier, and I think Brian may have touched on as well, I think it's accelerated a lot of work that we'd already seen underway over the previous years and broadened the scope of that work. So, for example, with remote work, it seems new, but actually I remember back in the 1990s and early 2000s, there were companies that were definitely dabbling in this as well for pockets of their workforce, but not really done at a large scale. Now with COVID, we've seen that through the great experiment of work from home for an office-based environment, at least, that it can really work for large swaths of employees. And in fact, employees seem to really like it. Different surveys have shown between about 42% or 80% of employees say that they would like to continue working at least on a part-time basis or in a hybrid environment, as it's being called, sometimes in an office, sometimes not. But they'd like that to continue for the long term. And so I think a lot of organizations, again, for those roles that tend to be able to be done on a computer, those will continue to be done remotely or partially remotely, I think, for the long haul. I think Salesforce is onto something, though many organizations probably won't go to an entirely remote model. The events of 2020 with regards to racial justice and the light that has been shown on bias and inequity, both in our communities at large as well as in our organizations, have really caused organizations to double down on their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and in efforts to create an environment of belonging that I think is really unprecedented. We haven't really seen organizations dive in this deeply before, and I do think that this is here to stay as well. And they're looking at way beyond just hiring practices, for example, and recruiting, but really looking at every aspect of the employment experience, from training to promotion, to mentorship, to leadership development cohorts and the like, to try and root out systemic bias and to really make sure that everyone feels included and can thrive. They're thinking about, how do we equip all of our employees to work inclusively together across all of our differences, and how to really value differences. And I'm not just talking about backgrounds and cultural differences, but differences in perspectives and the like. And then finally, you mentioned mental health. I definitely think this one's a bit newer to the conversation, but I certainly think that this is with us for some time. The research shows that about 76% of all US employees have struggled with a mental health issue. And employers are realizing that this is something they need to help support employees with as a workforce sustainability issue, as a business continuity issue. So they're not only thinking about benefits programs like providing mental health benefits, but how can we help prevent burnout? How can we help reduce stress? How can we navigate that time and place of work that Brian mentioned earlier, so it doesn't become overwhelming and unsustainable? So with all of these in mind, just a couple of thoughts. People often ask me, what skills should I be equipping myself with to thrive in this new environment, or actually with regardless of whatever the next trends are that may come our way. And I think it's really some of those interpersonal skills that would be advisable to focus on. So effective communication, active listening, practicing curiosity. Some of us have heard the term, you've heard of the term of growth mindset, or a willingness to learn new things and dig in, even if it's new to you, or how to demonstrate empathy and respect, especially across differences. These kinds of personal skills, soft skills are sometimes called, can really tee you up for success, to help adapt regardless of where or when you're working or how the work is done, can help you connect across the incredible diversity of our workforces now, and really tee yourself up for success.
That was really good. Sorry, Andrew. I wanted to say that I think the mental health piece is long overdue to have those conversations in the workplace, and the burnout too, right? Because I think that for some, working from home has probably helped to relieve some of the stress, or some of those everyday, if you're commuting 2 hours to get to work, now you don't have to, some of those small things that can make a difference in your mental health, and your stress level can go down. And then for others, maybe it's increased because now maybe you're at home and you're homeschooling the kids. And so now you have to deal with the stress level that you didn't have before. So talking and having the conversation about mental health, and like you said, Elizabeth, and supporting that, even with the new normal of working from home, it's heavily needed right now and need to be talked about more than ever.
About the growing interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion, I agree that it has been a huge change this year. And I do think much of it is here to stay. And one indication of that is that the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion is changing. Like, it's becoming more clear that there are performance benefits to companies that have more diverse boards of directors. And there's more like research showing links to innovation and better group decision-making and fewer blind spots. So that stuff is starting to be taught in business schools to our next generation of CEOs. And I really think that has a lock-in effect. Even if public opinion shifts away from it in coming years, like, companies are hiring chief diversity officers and hiring dedicated heads for diversity and inclusion in a way that they haven't before. Those kinds of investments are hard to dial back if the winds of public opinion change. So we had a piece of research this year where we saw almost a 40% increase in diversity and inclusion job openings around the country on our platform. And that's a sign of companies actually putting their money where their mouth is. It goes beyond statements. It's people whose job it is to make institutional change.
There's we see the same thing in terms of the focus on DE&I. There's another dimension that we saw an enormous amount of change in across 2020, which is going to fundamentally change work as well, which is the amount of data we collect about our employees. One of the major shifts that we see out there is And we saw this in the consumer space where companies like Facebook and Amazon, et cetera, like know the product you're going to buy before you need to buy it, sorts of things. That technology and that capability is moving into the workplace. And it's already there in a lot of cases. And 2020 really accelerated that. A couple of examples. When you look at large employers, so think here kind of Fortune 1000 companies and above, about 75% of them now have some sort of technology that they use to track their employees. So this is everything from location things to track where your cell phone is, to things that track how aggressively you're typing on your keyboard and using that as a predictor of stress, things that take your picture with your camera on your laptop to give a sense of, are you feeling frustrated or not? But all these devices around are tracking everything about their employees. And there was a massive increase in investments in that across 2020, and that data is now being turned into knowledge. So one of the other things that we're not going to unwind is that analytification of work. We're going to shift from managers managing based upon what they feel and know to a much more data algorithmic driven approach to management. For example, roll the clock ahead a couple of years, and your laptop is going to tell you that you've been sitting at your laptop too long and you should get up and take a walk. That might sound super creepy, and it probably does a little bit, but welcome to 2025. By the time we get there, that's exactly what's going to happen. And you look at all the implications of that. So one of the other major shifts from all this data that we're collecting about our employees, and again, companies have collected that data about their customers. Now we're collecting about our employees. There's a ton of implications from that. So one, at its extreme, about 65 to 70% of what a manager can do can be replaced by technology. So that's going to mean there's fewer roles for managers because you're going to need fewer of them. And the manager's job is going to shift from managing work to managing relationships, managing some of the emotional connections that are out there, being D&I advocates for the organization. But if you want a job in management going forward, kind of traditional management, it's not going to be a job 5 years from now of measuring and tracking people doing their tasks. It's going to be a job that's going to look a lot more like a clinical therapist, a school counselor, a social worker, whatever kind of framing makes the most sense for you. But that's another major shift, that the data we've got in technology that we've got to track employees is shifting what management means. And the other implication of that, by the way, is that in order to have a successful career, it is much more likely that part of that career path is going to go through some sort of individual contributor route, as opposed to simply management. That shift in career pathing, not just from skill set, but from type of job, management to IC, is going to be a clear marker of the more successful career journeys that are out there, and the ability to toggle back and forth across those is going to be really, really different across the next 5 to 10 years too.
Yeah, Brian, I think that you made a very good point. I think that traditional manager, that trajectory is almost dinosaur now, because I think an IC can contribute to an organization and be just as impactful and and a strong influencer as well within an organization. Now, you don't have to be, I always say leaders, you don't have to be a leader to lead. And I think that's what the case would be for individual contributors now.
Thank you so much for sharing those perspectives. And Brian, you're talking about the future and the future. Well, we're all talking about the future of work, but in general, in terms of the workplace, and a lot of people have fears around being monitored and what's happening. So I'm wondering, with this fear of the unemployment rates and the economy and the future and what the future looks like, what areas of the job market do you see big opportunities in today? And what areas are on the decline or are highly competitive? Andrew, what does your research say?
Well, for context, the economy went through a tremendous upheaval during COVID, and the US economy lost around 20 million jobs, which is an enormous figure, totally unprecedented. So since then, we've regained about 10 million. Or close to 11 million. So we're still down about 9 million jobs from where we were before COVID. The unemployment rate today is around 6.2%, and that's well above the 3.5% that we had before the pandemic, but it's way down from the close to 15% that we had during the early months of lockdowns, when there was widespread shuttering of businesses. So the context here for like where is up and where is down in terms of opportunities is that the economy overall is recovering rapidly today. And most economists I talk to expect a very robust economy in 2022 as more people get vaccinated and life begins to go back to normal very slowly. So, today we've got something like 30 vaccines being administered for every new case of COVID. And it's just a matter of time before we get over the hump and things start to return to normal. And there's a lot of pent up demand for tourism and travel, just all the life experiences that have been put on hold for many people during the past year. That's going to lead to an outpouring of consumer spending and potentially a lot of job growth in the coming year. So normally, for students graduating into a job market, coming out of the school into a recession environment is very negative and tends to affect people like for decades, but according to some research. But this recession is different in so many ways, and this might be a different case. Like I actually think this might be a very good time to be getting back into the job market this spring, as ramping hires up at many companies. So when we look at our job postings data and we look at hiring on Glassdoor and Indeed, our sister company, the biggest opportunities that I see today, there's a lot of conversations about tech, but I really think healthcare and any kind of roles supporting the healthcare sector, including pharmaceuticals, care for seniors, and tech roles inside the healthcare industry, like software developers who work at Kaiser or whatever. This is an enormous growth industry, especially with baby boomers rapidly moving into retirement and demanding more and more healthcare. It's just the 800-pound gorilla of the U.S. labor market. And I think that's the most important sector to know about opportunities in today. Second is anything in software development, engineering, and product management roles, not just in the tech sector, but across any industry. So whether you have an interest in retail or consulting or government or finance, there are developer roles and product manager roles in all of those sectors. The tech industry has really diffused into every industry today. And all of those have high pay and they're almost all facing some sort of labor shortage. And then third is anything in e-commerce, logistics, and supply chain operation. That's where we see huge labor shortages today. Anything related to supply chain, logistics, thinking about like Amazon's, taking over the world, almost every company moving into e-commerce, all the way up to software developers who work in that space. And those are extremely strong sectors today, and will continue to do so even after COVID. In terms of the areas with weakness, no surprise that one of the weakest areas we see is media, journalism, and publishing, which unfortunately is an area that attracts so many talented young students. It's just an industry that's just faced tremendous technological upheaval, and I really don't see a recovery coming anytime soon in that sector. A second sector to watch out for is government roles, especially state and local government roles, as the tax and revenue implications of COVID-19 still translate into budget adjustments in the coming year. So that government employment tends to lag 6 to 18 months behind the business cycle, and that's now basically. So, and then a third area is, of course, leisure and tourism and retail, which have just been hit so hard during COVID-19. They're going to continue to face upheaval and all kinds of changes in technology and relocation for the next year or two. And so those are areas that I would really worry about if someone was doubling down on those sectors.
Any other thoughts from the panelists?
Yeah, there is, in the data that Andrew's got is super interesting as you look at those industries and segments. One of the other things that's going to be different about jobs in the labor market is that the labor market's going to become a lot thicker. And what that basically means is there's going to be more companies willing to hire from more places, but more people looking for jobs in more places as well. So you can start to do your job from a more remote perspective. So what you're expecting to see as those labor markets become thicker is that there's really better matching between employees and employers. So if you've got the right skill sets in the right role, it's actually kind of an interesting time period just to see that thickness of labor markets as location becomes less of a constraint. But what's also important to note as you think about this is while there's been a lot of talk as we think about kind of jobs and roles and all those sorts of things, that we're going to have this massive number of people working remote full time. The data doesn't say or indicate that that's likely to happen. And this is something that Elizabeth alluded to a little bit earlier, which is, pre-pandemic, there's less than, out of the people that could do their jobs remote. So this is not everyone. So like if you're in retail, it would have been hard to do other jobs. If you're a doctor, it's really hard to do your job remote as a doctor, for example. But you look at other jobs that could be done remote, only about 10% of people pre-pandemic did. Our best estimate is that once there's an effective vaccination program in place, that we're going to go up to about 20% of people working remote full-time. The bigger part and the bigger change in the workplace is not, are we going to have all these people working remote? It's going to be, we're going to have some of the people coming into the office some of the time. So the conversation around the hybrid nature of the workforce. And that is going to be the far bigger change rather than just the remote change. Yes, more people will be working remote. It's still going to be a minority of employees who are working that way. The majority of employees are going to be in the office a couple of days a week, working from some other place a couple of days a week. And then there's going to be another minority of employees who work from the office full-time. Out of the jobs that can be done that way. But the real big shift is going to be, I come in on Monday, Andrew comes in on Tuesday, Sherry comes in on Wednesday, Elizabeth comes in on Thursday, and we're all in the same place, but we're never in the same place together. And understanding all the implications that are going to be associated with that and working at different time, even though we're working together, will have long-ranging implications for collaboration, innovation, communication, all sorts of stuff that we don't know yet how that's going to play out because we really haven't gotten there yet. We're only now beginning to scratch the surface of being there. But I just saw a couple of questions about, are we going to have a lot of remote work? We don't think so. We're going to have some, it's going to be more, but we're not going to be in a world where, half of the people are working remote full-time. That the social connections, the emotional connections, the need for collaboration, the need for some in-person activities are going to keep us coming together some of the time, but certainly not all the time.
I completely agree with you. And I think the COVID has shown that work can be done and remotely and especially likely we'll go forward with the hybrid environment. The trick is, how do we create a cohesive workplace culture? How do we create a cohesive corporate identity? How do we foster that connection and collaboration in that hybrid environment in particular, when we can't use face-to-face or traditional in-person events or touch points in order to create the connection? We actually have to be a lot more intentional about how we collaborate, how we communicate, and how we create a sense of community in our organizations, because some of us will likely be dispersed at some point during, of the day or of the week. So that's definitely going to be a challenge for employers, and we can't just use proximity to create culture anymore. We need to really think about what we're doing to create that sense of community. Something else you said, sometimes we get questions about, I'd really like to now move across the country, maybe move outside of the big city where my company is located. Can I move far away and still keep my job? That's something that you definitely want to, if anybody's entertaining that here on the call, you definitely want to talk to your employer about if you intend to stay with your employer, because there can be some tax implications, some legal compliance obligations of your employer if you move to another state, for example, in addition to the fact that, as you noted, Brian, we may be having people come in from time to time. It's not going to be likely a fully remote situation.
Yeah, I'll share with you something else that's a little bit scary and disappointing about remote as well, is managers on average are biased against people who work remote full-time. While all of the research shows that employees who work full-time remote can be just as productive as those folks who come into an office full-time, that those performance distribution curves are essentially identical. So there's no difference in performance for employees who work remote versus employees who work from an office. However, when you ask managers that same question, use some conjoint marketing type analysis to say, like, do they think it's different? The majority, like 3 out of 4 managers, think that people who come into the office are higher performing than people who work from home. So if you choose to want to be in a fully remote situation, one of the things to be aware of is that because of this bias, that it can be a career limiting decision to do that. Just to be totally transparent with people, doesn't sound fair, doesn't sound right, but it's true in terms of the bias that managers have. And one other thing to be really aware of, if you're going to be managing people who are working remote, we've been doing a lot of work to try to figure out, as a vaccination program rolls out, who's going to come back to the workplace and who wants to work from the workplace, who wants to work hybrid, who wants to work remote, and those sorts of things. And one of the things that we find is that men are more interested in coming back to work in an office place full time, and women are more interested in working remote or hybrid. And again, keep in mind that there's no difference in performance across that. However, given the manager bias, the different decisions that we see men and women making about where they would prefer to work, we are running into a situation where, as those things come together, that managers, if nothing is done about it, will give higher raises and are more likely to promote men compared to women, even though there's not a difference in performance. That will make a gender wage gap, and we can debate how big or small it is, but a gender wage gap exists. It will make it worse unless you, as future managers and leaders, are really thoughtful about how you're going to be managing a remote hybrid work and keeping aware of this bias. And if you're choosing to work in different ways, understanding what those implications are and then what you can do about it. But I would really caution folks that if you're gonna work remote full-time, and companies are hiring there and there will be an increase, really thinking through and understanding the career implications for it, and also how do you build those social and emotional connections with your manager to make sure that your manager, who is potentially unfairly biased against you, does not translate that into career impacting decisions that they make about you. But just want to be completely transparent about how that landscape is going to play out. A couple of years from now, maybe it's different and we've learned and managers gotten smarter and companies gotten smarter. But at least for the next year, that is likely to be the situation for people as they're moving into a labor market, if they're choosing to work remote full-time from that perspective.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Brian. I think the equity issues can be substantial in this kind of a hybrid environment. At the level that you described, for example, where bias can impact these things like promotion pay, ratings and the like, but even on the more micro level, in terms of if you have a group of employees who are in a room having a conversation, out of sight can be out of mind. I mean, you may forget that your colleague isn't in the room who needs that information as well, or simple things like how to have an effective remote meeting where some people are physically in a space together and some people aren't. We saw this before COVID, and I think we've definitely learned the importance of making sure we have a level playing field in terms of being able to simply hear everyone in the meeting, not having side conversations, ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to have their perspective shared and their voices lifted up. So being very intentional in training not only our managers, but also ourselves on how to be inclusive in information sharing, in communications and the like is really going to be critical to making this work.
I 100% agree with you, Elizabeth, on that. Absolutely. Most importantly, it is, we have to, as employees and also as managers, we also have to take the initiative to educate ourselves, right? If we are not getting that support from our leaders within our organizations, and we have a specific type of value system, then we need to look at what can I do to empower myself and empower the people who work for me as well. And lead by example. So your peer may not be doing the same thing and may have a different view than you do, but your value system is driving how you treat your employees, and you want to make sure that you're supporting what they need and that you're educating yourself on what's important as well. So sometimes we have to take time to also educate ourselves even if we're not getting that at work.
Thank you, Sherry, and thank you, everybody else. Now, our final question before we head into the audience Q&A, which we have quite a few questions, so I'm excited about that. If you found yourself unemployed today, what are the first 3 things you would do right away? Sherry, you want to start us off?
Sure. The first thing I would do is think about now, and I know we've had a lot of talk about remote work and how it may go away, it may increase by 20% when we all get back into the office. However, right now, for someone who's unemployed, if you are in a market to where the work that you do is limited in terms of openings, now your market actually has widened, because you may be able to find an opportunity to work remotely doing the same role where you are now, but in it for an employer that's in another city. So I think that is a plus for right now for people who are unemployed. That yeah, your market has widened a little bit now with the remote working, which I think is great for someone who may be in a more tighter job market for their industry. The next thing to think about, I would think about, is assessing my network. Who is in my network where I can get the word out? Because a lot of times some roles are still about who you know. Referrals are still king if they're coming from the right person. So, assess your network and who's in it right now in your industry, and see who you'll get the word out to that you're looking for a new opportunity and possibly be referred. And, a lot of employers have a referral bonus program, and that could be a great opportunity for them to also earn some extra bucks if you're hired for that position. So, assess your network. And I think I'm one of those people that you should always be expanding your network, whether you're working or not, because you just never know when you may have to call out to your network for a new opportunity, whether you're unemployed or if you're employed and looking for a new opportunity. So you should always be connecting and expanding your network. The third thing I would do, if I've been in a position for a very long time and I have not interviewed in a very long time, I want to reassess what that looks like. And in today's environment with COVID, you might want to look at your technology and make sure you're preparing yourself for a video interview. I've been out the market for a long time, because things have changed a little bit, and you want to make sure that you're preparing yourself for that type of process. And also too, do some research and find out specifically about what that looks like now. Panel interviews, you may go through 5 interviews. It may be with the recruiter, the hiring manager, then it may be a dotted line manager, or maybe someone else that they want to be involved in the process to get the buy-in, because you still may support that department. So just kind of, get abreast of, educate yourself on what the interview process looks like now. And then make sure you're preparing for that. And then the last thing you want to do is make sure that you are prepared to negotiate, right? Make sure that you understand what your market pays for the role that you're seeking out now, and then looking at and assessing what your current salary or what your former salary was, and then what you're looking for now. Always look at what your minimum should be, what your minimum you can work with, and then what your ideal salary is. But be realistic about that. You can go to salary.com, Glassdoor, where Andrew works.com, to find out what those salaries are in your area. And two, you want to make sure that not only are you negotiating, but you need to be prepared. You need to also be prepared for, can you say no? Be prepared to say no to that role if it's not what you want it to be, and know what your laws are too, because not every state, in some states it's illegal for them to ask you what your former salary was. So you want to make sure that you're up to date on, know what they can ask you and what's inappropriate for them to ask of you, and you stay firm on what is your minimum and what's your maximum, and then just be prepared to negotiate. And you can negotiate more than salary now. You're in a position now where you can negotiate a lot more than salary. And hybrid working is one of those things that you can negotiate among some other things, except for benefits. You can't do that because that's contractual with the employers. You can't do that. However, there's a lot more that you can work on negotiating. And places like Glassdoor.com, they have great information on and tips on how to do that.
One other thought for folks is we spend a lot of time thinking about jobs or roles. Another lens to really think through is just companies that are growing quickly. One way to think about this is not just say, I want X job or wherever, but it's like, find companies that are growing fast, because they're not going to have all their jobs posted, but there's a ton of hiring that's going on with those companies. And if you're growing fast, you need people. And if you've got skill sets that are close to any of the types of jobs that they're hiring for, they just go through the hiring. They hire more people, but two, they go through the hiring process faster. So the time it spends to actually find that job and actually start working, it's just quicker. So I would, create a list of, in the locations that are interest to you, or the remote places that you can potentially work with, find the 20 fastest growing companies and just apply to those. And don't worry about the job so much, but apply to anything that might be a good fit, just because the hit rate and the speed is going to be faster at those types of companies than a slow growth company. Just they don't have the same urgency to hire people as a fast growing company does.
Yeah, and you know, Brian makes a very good point, because, and do not rule out working for a startup, because you're going to be in a position where, again, they are going to be hiring fast, they're growing fast, and you could come in, you may have be unemployed in your former position, you may have been a manager, but you may come into that startup as an individual contributor. But guess what? You may end up being a manager in 6 months or a year, depending on how their growth. So I just think you should always leave yourself open to considering startups, because it's a good way to lend your expertise to that industry, to that job, to help that organization grow. And then more than likely, you will also be promoted as well.
Okay, so thank you so much to our panelists for this amazing discussion. Now we're going to turn to questions from our audience. We have quite a few. We won't unfortunately be able to get to all of them, but we'll try to get through as many as we can. And my colleague, Luis Valencia, is going to be joining us to read those questions out for us.
Yes, thank you, Randeep. There were a couple of questions in the Q&A section about ageism in the workplace, about companies judging on, I guess, age. So do you guys have anything to say on that and how they can navigate that?
Yeah, age discrimination, I believe, is actually one of the most persistent forms of discrimination today. It doesn't get as much attention as it should. And I honestly also think that in some ways it's the most enabled form of discrimination in our workplaces, whether through sort of our own biases and assumptions about capabilities of people based on age, as well as sometimes structures that are in place that tend to favor the young professionals in our workforces as opposed to those with more experience. There's a lot of work that I'm personally committed to doing to change those views. And one thing that's really critically important is for organizations to become aware of these biases and assumptions, to check those biases and assumptions at all facets of the employment experience. This should be a critical part of your diversity, equity, and inclusion training. That age is just as critical an issue to be focusing on as others. And to really make sure that the systems that are in place and the structures and processes in your organization aren't inadvertently discriminating against people based on age. And that goes for actually younger and older. We tend to think of it in terms of discrimination and harassment against older workers, but there are some biases against younger workers as well, assuming that lack of tenure in the organization means lack of ability to handle substantial projects. So there's work to be done on all ends of the spectrum.
I would chime in here and say one of the biggest challenges older workers face in the technology industry is like a mismatch in perception of like what they're looking for. Like, are they new to a field, or are they like really leaning on 20 years of experience and want to be a senior leader role and have a big staff? So I think, just because you're have more years of experience in a field, you might have pivoted recently and moved into a new area that you don't have as much experience in, and you're willing to get in at more of a mid-level or ground level. I just think you have to be more careful about setting expectations with employers about exactly what you're trying to accomplish, and be clear to them, because the biggest barrier many older workers face is the perception that they're overqualified and would not be willing to accept a more junior position or stay in it. So if that's something you're open to, you have to really communicate that.
Yeah, I agree with Andrew too. And I think sometimes they have that perception that they may be out of the salary range too. They may think, oh my goodness, they're so senior, they're not going to accept the salary range that we have for the role. And that may not necessarily be true. So that's another assumption.
There's another question. Someone's curious to know the extent to which academia, institutional, and theoretical approaches will interface with small entrepreneurs, businesses, startups, and individuals starting their own businesses because they are outside the desired talent pool. Ageism, sexism, racism, put another way, the theoretical with the practical, the academic with the tech, the mathematical, engineering, scientific with the social, emotional, psychological. Yeah, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll share with you one thing that's really interesting. When you look at hiring that is made for people with PhDs right now, that go into the private sector don't go into academia. There's more people that are hired with cross-functional PhDs than pure play PhDs. So like rather than someone who's got a PhD in economics, someone who's got a PhD in environmental economics or technology of economics or what it might be. So it's that application that companies are looking for a greater degree. So there is a real sense from companies that that next big breakthrough of ideas is not going to come from getting better at the thing you've been doing, but the next breakthrough is going to come at the intersection of two things. And so the people that have the ability to navigate at an intersection of something, of two historical things that have been siloed, there's going to be a ton of jobs from that perspective, a ton of opportunity from that perspective. The pure play ones, it's going to be harder, but there's just less interest in the private sector for those sorts of jobs and people with those sorts of backgrounds and the more interdisciplinary backgrounds.
I agree with Brian. I think also that there's often if you've spent all of your adult life in academia and this is your first jump outside to private sector, many people will be concerned that you will not be able to move fast or be flexible, or maybe would be removed from like business considerations. I think that that's a common perception of people who come from an academic background, is that they don't adapt well to private sector. So I think if you're someone who has a lot of academic experience and not a lot of work experience, you need to do a good job putting together a portfolio of work and just like demonstrating more work potential. That's where I would double down rather than leaning too heavily on credentials.
There's another question on switching careers during the pandemic and how to maximize your efforts when job searching.
Yeah, I think you would need to assess of course, your transitional skills, but first target what if you're talking about transitioning into another industry, target that role and study what is required for those roles, and compare your current skill sets now to what you currently have and what you may need. And then, of course, if there's education involved or certifications involved, then you'll need to also plan out what's required. Again, that's looking at your network. If you need to mentor, if you need to volunteer, and then the soft skills that are necessary. Being agile is so important in today's, work market, and across the board, you need to make sure you have some soft skills that will play well into what you're wanting to move into next. So I think taking some assessments would be great. So career assessments to look at, your workplace personality, and looking into what your strengths are, and playing up on those things, highlighting those things specifically on your LinkedIn page, also on your resume, and getting really familiar and clear about what you bring to the table and who you are, and then being able to show what you're able to do in that new role as well. So yeah, it's going to take you getting to know yourself all over again from a workplace perspective or a professional perspective if you wanted to transition into a new role. And that's the same for anybody who's desiring to be an entrepreneur as well. If you do an assessment of what strengths and weaknesses you currently have and what you will need. And it's okay to be real about or be honest about, well, you know what, I'm lacking this. It's about taking action to strengthen that skill set the best way, how, or obtaining that whatever you need that can make yourself marketable when you're transitioning into a new industry. And it doesn't hurt, again, to assess your network and see who's in your network and start networking with people who are already in the industry, because they can teach you what the best practices are and things that you really need to know that can help to navigate you in the door. And don't be afraid to move into an entry-level role to get in, because sometimes you have to take 2 steps back to make 2 steps forward to get into the industry. So sometimes you have to make a sacrifice when you're looking to make a career transition.
One other thought on that one is to think really hard about skills adjacencies. Mm-hmm. What are not the jobs that are like 5 steps away, but what are the ones that are 1 step away, then 1 step away, then 1 step away? Because making that 5-step move is really hard. And 2, to Sherry's point, if you're going to make that 5-step move, you're almost guaranteed to go backwards before you can go forwards. Mm-hmm. But if you think about kind of 1, 1, 1, it's a little bit better. The other thing to keep in mind as you're thinking about kind of the 1 step over rather than the 5 steps over is the way a lot of recruiting algorithms work is that it's still very keyword dependent. And if you talk to the recruiting platforms out there and like the search engines that they use, they get a ton of resumes, so they have to have some sort of sifting process. But it's very keyword dependent still. At the end of the day, and we talk about how sophisticated algorithm this, sophisticated machine learning that. A lot of it's still just keyword searches. So understand the keywords that are in the skills adjacency for the job that you're looking for, and make sure that you're able to cast the skills that you've got in that language, in that job that has the skills adjacency, using that skills adjacencies language, not the language that you have within your current role. Because you don't want to miss out on an opportunity that you've totally qualified for, you've got the skills for, you've got the desire for, but you're using the wrong word. So like a perfect example of this is actuaries are data scientists. But if you're an actuary and you say you're an actuary and someone's hiring a data scientist, they're gonna be like, that's an actuary, I want a data scientist. But if you're an actuary and you say you do data science, the people hiring data scientists are gonna be like, a data scientist. It's ridiculous, it's silly, it's nonsensical, but that's the reality. Use the keywords in the skills adjacencies that you actually have and have the capability. You don't want to lie, obviously, but use the right vocabulary. It makes a ton of difference in an automated, algorithmic based recruiting world.
And he's right. And also to Brian's point, when you do that, and if you get a call back and they schedule a phone screen or you move to an interview, the interview stage, you want to, this is your opportunity to really show them you understand the industry, you understand the work itself, because they're going to more likely give you a chance or an opportunity if they know that you understand the work and understand what they do and how it's done in their organization. So that's critical, right? That's critical. That having the keywords is great. That's what's going to get them to give you a call. That you need to, once you're in the interview, you need to make sure that you elaborate on the role, that you have a clear understanding, explaining that you comprehend and know what you know about the role itself. So that's important.
I completely agree. And the one other thing I would add on to that is when you're in that interview or as you're having that conversation, being able to tell the story of why this job and why now in your career, or how did you get here and how does this job, this new role absolutely make sense for you and for where you're going. I find that being able to tell that story of how the experiences I've had in my past and what I want to accomplish, and this role is the next logical step in that journey, is incredibly powerful in helping you land that job. If employers can't understand the progression of where you've come from and where you're going in a way that feels that makes sense and that is compelling, they might have questions about, I'm not quite sure this is a good fit. But if you can tell your story of how you got to be from where you are to where you want to be, I think that can be incredibly persuasive.
Your thoughts on how can companies prevent the devaluing of employees who continue to work remotely as we transition to hybrid, in-person, and remote work environments?
Speak up. I think that's the main two words is, speak up, find a way to remain visible. In our organization, we do a social hour every Thursday at 4, so we can connect with each other, and we have, we'll just share, about why we're here and why we love what we do, and have the employees have an opportunity to ask up questions about what's your favorite movie, is it, Haagen-Dazs or Ben and Jerry's, and just get to know more about them. And it gives them a break from just being in the grind of the day of the work. And it keeps us connected as peers and colleagues and employees overall together. So speak up, make suggestions, offer to volunteer to be part of some sort of committee, or even initiate something that can help to connect everyone together. So I think sometimes employees are afraid to initiate and speak up. And that's the two words I always say, and speak up. Closed mouths don't get fed. You always got to make the ask. You don't know until you ask. And the worst that can happen is you say no.
Yeah. For us introverts out there, a remote world is going to be harder because doing that asking is tough in general, but even tougher when you're not there as much. But what Sherry's talking about is, like, she's totally right. And it's just going to be even more important to do that. And if that's something you struggled with, like myself included, the effort that you've got to do that is completely necessary if you don't want to be career limited from that perspective. And like, you know, I'm a PhD, I'm a researcher by heart. Like, I'd much rather be hanging out, like messing around with data and doing stuff like that. But like, that's not going to be a way to have a great career in a much more remote hybrid world. It's like, sorry, but that's one of the realities of a more remote hybrid world, is that you're gonna have to advocate for yourself to a much greater degree. And like what Sherry's talking about right there, she is totally right, especially for us introverts.
I agree. And I think this is also one area where we as colleagues can also model and advocate for each other. I think if we see that people are being excluded from a meeting, for example, and this goes for whether they're in the room or not, actually, if someone's voice is not being able to be amplified, if someone's being interrupted, if someone's not getting the information they need, if they were not invited to the meeting and you looked at that invite list and realized they weren't there, we can ask, you know, and say, I really think that this person needs to be a part of this conversation, or I really think we need to invite some other perspectives. And so if you feel comfortable speaking up, doing so not only benefits yourself, but we can use that, we can role model that for our leaders, for our colleagues, and really start to institutionalize those inclusive practices to mitigate some of those biases that are happening.
Thoughts on how will employment and hiring be impacted by the rapid rise of automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning in the next 2 to 5 years?
There's been a lot of research about this. I would say the most important thing to know about the future of work and automation is to learn something about the history of automation and work. You know, for 100 years, jobs have continually been created when new technologies emerge, and people learn to team up with technology, and then in some cases, technology completely replaces jobs. But the reality is most jobs aren't completely replaced by technology. They team up with them, and small parts of a job get automated. Like the most routine, unpleasant parts of a job typically get taken over by a piece of software or a piece of machine. And that leaves behind like essentially human tasks that involve creativity and flexibility and relationship building and other things. So I think the growth of technology just fuels the movement toward requiring higher education to build more of those soft skills, like it will reward people that are creative and flexible and learn how to adapt technologies to make themselves have more scale. You know, like a carpenter with an air-powered hammer can hammer in 1,000 times more nails than someone with a manual hammer. You have to think of technology that way. Like that's the best way to position yourself as an employee. But the pace of adoption tends to be relatively slow, and I wouldn't expect things to go off a cliff overnight, and you wouldn't expect big surges in unemployment due to changes in technology and automation. It will happen slowly over time. But I think the most important thing is trying to stay ahead of the curve and figuring out, like looking around you and looking at what are the most routine parts of my job that require no brain power. That's a part of my job that some technology is coming for and is going to take away. You need to figure out how to continually pivot yourself. So like one example from my personal experience in tech is in the early days of technology, there was a lot of QA engineers who would basically try to break new software when it came out in the testing phase. They'd go through it manually and try to find bugs. That became automated, and now we have test automation engineers who basically run the automated software that simulates thousands of people going through an app, checking all the menus to make sure nothing breaks. So that's like a leveling up. And now one quality assurance automation engineer can do like 10,000 times more testing than an old QA engineer could do. And so their job is actually better, even though there might be fewer of them. So that's the way you should be thinking about it, is don't let your skill set go stale, and look at new technology as an opportunity, like a way to make yourself have scale and be bigger. Technology can give you superpowers if you adopt it the right way. You shouldn't necessarily be just fearful of it.
I'll tell you a really cool story real quick. Well, Sherry, actually, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, there's jobs where people think that they're totally protected from technology, and that's just not true. To Andrew's point, everything's coming. So like a place that is just really interesting to me is the legal profession. So paralegals are being automated away in some cases because it's easier to use automation to search through historical precedents rather than having a paralegal do it. So you would think that those jobs would go away, and they are, but they're really changing in a lot of different ways. And what's happening now when you look at where the venture capital money is going in the legal profession, it is for people trying to come up with algorithms about who would win a court case. And so there's companies now that will find people to sue other people because they think their algorithm is going to win in a court case, and they're willing to essentially back other people to sue other people when it becomes algorithms rather than lawyers battling in a court case. Then from there, the market's evolved even more, where there's companies that have gambling pools and insurance funds on lawyers who are battling each other with algorithms rather than with arguments. And so what is going to happen when you look at it from that space and apply that to other places, these jobs are going to change dramatically. We just have no idea in which way it's going to happen, but we know with certainty that it's going to shift from fewer tasks to more imagination. And as you think about whatever you're doing, tasks get automated, imagination gets rewarded. And that's the way you got to think about jobs and careers going forward.
We have time for 2 more questions. What are your thoughts on the impact of technology such as blockchain into areas where tech hasn't been too ingrained? In other words, what are the big disruptors in your opinions?
I think that you have to remember most companies in the world are small companies. Most companies are not the big Facebooks and Googles and Amazon who are deploying like super sophisticated AI and machine learning. Most companies need like nuts and bolts data analysts and some planning and some forecasting. And so I think big disruptors out there are pieces of software that make basic business functions in HR, legal, and IT more efficient and just simpler. Things that make hiring easier are big disruptors potentially. And as I mentioned before, tech jobs are diffusing all over into all sorts of sectors, from education to consulting to government. And that's changing the way companies think about scale. And so I don't know. It's also changing the norms, frankly, like the kind of workplace norms and dress codes and benefit packages in technology have started to spread to finance and other sectors, partly because they're hiring the same talent. Like you're having to compete with the tech sector for certain engineers now, and that's porting over certain norms about the way we work and innovation and things like that.
I tell you, if someone knows a lot about blockchain and you really want to disrupt the talent landscape and the talent marketplaces out there, if you could apply blockchain to resumes to make sure that resumes aren't faked and lied about, you would make a ton of money and companies would buy that all the time. People have gone back and looked at LinkedIn, and depending upon what you consider a big lie versus a little lie, somewhere between like 25 and 60% of people have significant fabrications on their LinkedIn profile, again, depending upon what you consider. If you could blockchain people's resume or blockchain their LinkedIn profile, like, you'd be printing money to the bank.
There's a free startup idea. Thank you, Brian.
Like I throw them out right and left. There plenty more to come.
We are actually hitting time. Before we wrap up, Elizabeth and Sherry, any final thoughts on this last question or in general as we kind of wrap up?
Yeah, I would just say just keep your mind open and do your homework to stay abreast of technology in your industry. And just what you like something in coming, watching things like this in future work and understanding what it is now and being adaptable to that. And I know that whether you're introvert or extrovert, you have to look and see what's, what changes and things you need to be adapting to based on who you are, your personality, your work style, and all those things, just to make sure that you are moving the needle in your career in the right direction. And it just takes effort from you to do that. So just keep your mind open and be open to educating yourself along the way.
I agree. I think having that sort of proactive posture, it's not, will they like me? Will I like you as you're interviewing with different organizations? It's just as much about finding an organization that has the same values or their passions that you do. And if you find an organization where you want to work that fits all those criteria, as Sherry recommended earlier, be proactive in reaching out, advocate for yourself, negotiate, definitely negotiate. I've negotiated with every job I've ever had, and I've never regretted it. So it never hurts to ask, and it generally will benefit you. So be your best advocate. Don't be shy, and I'm sure you'll have great success.
Andrew, Ryan, final words?
You know,
Go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say, I think that it is an amazing time in a lot of ways. There's lots of ability to kind of guesstimate as to what is going to happen. And there's lots of, smart, thoughtful people who are trying to think it through. This is also a time where there's just an opportunity to be really creative about things. And there's the rules that we've had that have dictated job search, careers, all that sort of stuff for the last 100 years aren't going to apply for the next 20. And be willing to embrace that experimentation and try something different. I think the people who do are going to be rewarded from that perspective.
My final word is, I think a common mistake young people make is they aim for the stars and aim only at the biggest, most high profile companies, the Googles, Apples, and Facebooks of the world. And I think you could benefit tremendously from starting your career at a small, scrappy place, because you will learn a lot of skills, and you'll be forced to be entrepreneurial and learn to roll up your sleeves, and you'll get to dabble in a lot of different parts of the business. Whereas if you work at a larger, more specialized place, you'll have less domain. Like, you'll be working in one specific area, and you might never be exposed to a data science or an engineering or a sales role or whatever. In a small place, you end up having to do a little bit of everything. So that's been my experience, and I think people should not hold out for the big offer from a high profile company that will impress their friends and family. Get in where you fit in and start building something, even if it's at a small unknown company.
Great advice, Andrew. Great advice.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists, Sherry, Elizabeth, Andrew, Brian. Amazing insights into what the future of work holds. Thank you.